So let's explore a bit further the model that de Saussure formulated to conceptualize the meaning and the function of signs. So as I mentioned earlier, everything is a sign. The general term used for any words or sounds or images which carry any sort of meaning is a sign. These signs stand for or represent the concepts and the conceptual relations between those concepts which we carry around in our heads, and together they constitute our everyday lives and the meaning systems of our culture. The model that de Saussure proposed is a dyadic model. Dyadic means an interaction between two things. So monadic is one, triadic is three, but de Saussure proposed a dyadic model of signs as being combinations of two elements, the signifier and the signified, or the sign vehicle and the meaning that it represents. So the signifier, that part of a sign, is the physical or material part of a sign, the material or physical form that a sign takes. So the word or the image or the sound is the part of the sign that's perceived by one or more of our sensory faculties: sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. The signifier is the perceptible part of the sign. This form serves as the delivery vehicle for the sign's meaning, to carry that meaning from sender to receiver. The signifier represents and stands for something beyond itself, which is the signified. And the signified is the corresponding side of the sign. It's the flip side of the sign. It's the other half contrasting with the signifier. So the signified is the corresponding mental concept that the signifier evokes in your mind upon perceiving it. So the ideas, the emotions, the values, etc., that you associate with that perceived signifier. So every time you hear or see or read or touch or smell a signifier, it's referring to a particular signified meaning. The signified is the purely conceptual part of the sign. It doesn't exist in any physical or material reality. It just exists in the mental image that's evoked in your head upon perceiving a certain signifier. The signified is a purely psychological reality. It can't be seen or heard or perceived. It just exists in our heads as a concept or idea that accompanies the signifier that is perceived. Like if I say the word dog to you, the word itself, dog, the sound I make when saying it, the letter spelled out D-O-G, that's the signifier. But then the image in your head of a dog is the signified, and that has no material or physical existence. Like it doesn't physically conjure up a dog out of thin air. It's constructed psychologically, that part of the sign. So dogs can bark, dogs can bite, but the concept of a dog can't bark or bite. Yet when we see a sign that says beware of dog, we know exactly what it means without even having to perceive or experience physically hearing a bark or feeling it's a bite or even seeing the dog at all. And signifieds can be even more abstract than that. Concepts that we can't in any simple way see or feel or somehow perceive. So think of concepts like war or friendship or love. Like those are pretty abstract concepts that don't take a single perceivable form, but I can still say I can still communicate the signifiers of the word war, or a picture of a battlefield, or two people looking at each other and shaking their fists, and it'll help evoke that more abstract signified of war. Or love, like there's no one form or definition for love to take. But you see someone communicate the signifier of a heart emoji or a Valentine's Day gift or a wedding ring, and it can evoke that signified of the concept and meaning of love. Not only things that don't exist in a physical form, but things that don't exist at all. So like a mermaid. Mermaids don't exist in real life as far as we know. I have some theories, but I'll spare you. But even when I say the word mermaid, I'm sure it evokes roughly the same mental images in each of your individual minds of, some sort of being with the top half of a woman and the bottom half of a fish. So signifiers are a bit more limited in terms of the physical forms they can take, but the concepts, the signifieds that they represent can be a lot more abstract, or like I said, not even exist in physical reality at all. So every single sign has these two sides as part of it. There's the signified half and the signifier half, and they are as inseparable as two sides of a piece of paper. You simply can't have one without the other. I'm wondering if you can think of any examples of a sign that's purely signifier without any signifieds attached to it, or vice versa. Is there a word or a symbol or an image you can think of that's 100% signifier with no mental concepts attached or associated to it? Or vice versa, are there any mental constructs you can think of that don't manifest themselves in some sort of physical embodiment of a signifier? So can you have a word without sense? Or can you have sense without a word to describe it? You arguably could, but it wouldn't have meaning. The signified and the signifier working in conjunction with each other is what gives meaning to signs. And it's these two interdependent components, the perceptual component in the signifier and the conceptual opponent in the signified, that belong to every sign, and each side triggers the other in an associative link. And the relationship between signifier and signified, that process of triggering when you see a certain or perceive a certain signifier and it triggers the accompanying signified meaning, and vice versa, if you have a meaning in your head and want to communicate it through a signifier, that relationship is called signification. And it's significant. So I have an idea of a tree, and I draw a tree on a piece of paper, and that drawing on a material piece of paper is the signifier in this case. Whereas the original idea in my head was the signified that I want to express through the signifier of that drawing of a tree on a piece of paper. And then I pass that piece of paper over to you. You look at it, you perceive it, it hits one or more of your sensory faculties, and then it conjures up a non-material image in your head of a tree, which is the signified meaning that I wanted to get across. The mental representation that's evoked behind the mere material representation you see on the piece of paper. And that's how meaning is conveyed through symbols. I can't just think of a tree and then telepathically insert that idea into your head. I need some sort of physical delivery vehicle to represent that meaning and transport the meaning to you. And things can get lost in translation if that picture of a tree doesn't conjure up the mental image that I intended when drawing and sending it. Maybe you were raised in a desert ecosystem where you've never seen a tree before. So perceiving that drawing of a tree on a piece of paper won't evoke any meaningful concepts in your head because you formed no prior experiences of it to refer back to. Or maybe my drawing skills are so poor that my tree doesn't even look like a tree to other people who see it. In that case, I chose a poor signifier to represent the signified that I'm trying to deliver. And when we think of signifiers, most of them take the visual form, as in the previous case of the tree, but a signifier is really anything that can be perceived by any of the five senses. So smell, for example. If you smell smoke, then that smoky odor is a signifier for the idea that something is burning or on fire. Even the sense of taste. Have you ever eaten something that tasted kind of off, but you ate it anyways, only to end up falling ill or getting food poisoning or something? the weird taste that you experienced was a signifier that your body was trying to deliver to you to warn you that the food is bad for you in some way. Or the sense of touch. If you touch a doorknob and it's hot, that might indicate the signified meaning of a fire being behind the door. Or you try to pet a porcupine and get pricked by one of its sharp spines, then the pain you perceive is signifying the idea of danger and bodily harm, and conjures up the idea of avoiding touching that animal for your own safety, and you thus then govern your conduct accordingly. So the production and the reception of signs and the signified meanings behind them is how we go about our everyday lives. We receive all sorts of sensory stimuli throughout our day, and that depending on our mental constructs, we interpret those signifiers in various ways and then act upon them. So going back to the green light and the red light, if those signifiers didn't each have their own signified meanings attached to them, which we then interpret and react to, then the world would be thrown into chaos as a result of the lack of meaning through which we structure our lives around, and all of our social interactions. And all of the words we use would be meaningless, and everyday life as we know it would be thrown into complete disarray. So de Saussure presented these elements of a sign, the constituent parts, the two halves of the whole, the signifier and the signified, as being completely interdependent, with neither one pre-existing the other. So according to him, you can't have a signifier without a signified, and vice versa. So within the context of a spoken language, he thought that a sign couldn't consist of just sound without any sense behind it, or of sense without being vocalized in the form of a sound. But do you agree with de Saussure on this? Can you think of a situation where a sign could consist of one part without the other? Or can you have a form without meaning, or meaning without form? That's one question you could potentially try to address in your lecture comment, or referring to earlier parts of the lecture, you can talk about what it takes to collectively change the meaning of a word or a symbol. Maybe give an example of a word or symbol whose meaning has changed throughout or over time, or really any ideas in this lecture that you really picked up on and would like to discuss further. Also, de Saussure stressed that there's no intrinsic, inherent, essential, transparent, self-evident, or natural connection between the signifier and the signified. So between the sound of a word and the concept to which it refers. For example, the word red has no natural connection to the concept or the essence of redness. It's not like there's any universal law that dictates that the color must be referred to by that name. And we can see that from the fact that other cultures and languages have come up with their own names for the color red, such as rouge in French. Like, between the signifiers of the word red and the word rouge, do any of them do any better or worse of a job of signifying the meaning, the concept of redness? Of course, it depends on the culture you're in. If you're in an English culture and have never learned a French word before, then you hear the word rouge and it won't evoke the concept of the color red in your head, and vice versa. So he considered signification to be an arbitrary process that humans and societies establish at will. Things don't naturally possess intrinsic meaning. Instead, they become signs only when we invest them with meaning and interpret it as a sign with meaning. So for example, there's no inherent natural reason to call something growing out of the ground with a trunk and branches a tree. Like, there's no natural connection between that combination of those four English letters and that natural phenomenon of that thing growing out of the ground. It's not like the first person who ever saw one of these arboreal plants just automatically said, oh, that's obviously a tree. It's abundantly clear that that's what we should call it. There's no natural connection between the four letters TREE arranged to make the word tree and the natural phenomenon that we now refer to as trees. But we've deliberately chosen as humans and societies to refer to them as trees and create meaning and assign that meaning to that combination of four letters and derive meaning by interpreting it when we hear the word tree to represent the mental concept of a tree. Trees could have just as easily been called something else from the very beginning, and it would come just as naturally to us now by any other name. But since humans and societies have grown to call them trees, even just hearing the word tree evokes in your head that mental image of that thing growing out of the ground with a trunk and branches and leaves. It's not completely random because, as Saussure mentioned, it has something to do with the structure of a language and, its various rules for arranging consonants and vowels. So the word tree fits well within the English language because of its formal rules for vowels and consonants flowing in a certain order, so that it was more likely to be called a tree than a TBKY, because that arrangement of letters, a tabuki, isn't as readily allowed within the structure of our language. De Saussure also stressed that the signs we use in writing are arbitrary. The letters, such as the letter T, like that symbol of two lines crossing each other to form a T, has no natural connection with the T sound it denotes, but it comes to seem so natural to us after spending our whole lives associating that letter with that sound. Like, now you can't think of it any other way. In an alternate universe somewhere, there are people who use the letter L to represent the T sound, and we can't even comprehend that. So we've chosen and agreed upon to use the color red for things like stop signs, but red doesn't universally mean stop in nature. If that were true, then poisonous frogs would be bright red instead of the variety of neon colors that most poisonous frogs are. In other settings, red may stand for or symbolize blood or danger or communism, but it could also represent victory or festivities and celebration and joyousness, like the red envelopes in Chinese New Year. And green doesn't naturally mean go. It could represent Ireland, the Emerald Isle, or the environmentalism, or envy, to be green with envy, or to be so sick that your face turns green. These meanings can change depending on the cultural context you find yourself in and the historical context you find yourself in. Like, we're no longer in the throes of the Cold War, so we don't really associate red with communism anymore, but there was a time where sayings and slogans and propaganda abounded about "I'd rather be dead than red," because of the cultural conventions of that specific historical era. So the arbitrary nature of signs mean they contain no inherent meaning or fixed meaning in themselves, but only acquire meaning when placed in relation to other signs. So when compared to other signs in their proximity, they gain meaning through difference and contrast. So what gives red meaning, like I said, isn't within the color itself or even the word itself. It's the difference between red and green, which produces the signification and results in meaning. If you couldn't differentiate between red and green, then you couldn't use one to mean stop and the other to mean go. All signs in themselves, existing within a vacuum, are arbitrary. They only gain meaning by being differentiated from other signs. It's the relations and differences between signs that creates meaning more so than the signs in themselves. So we can only know red by knowing that it's not green. If we didn't know green and its associated meanings, then we couldn't know red and its associated meanings. A tree is a tree because it's not a bush or a plant or other words within the system that it differentiates and contrasts itself from. So concepts aren't defined solely in terms of their content as if they exist in a vacuum. What actually characterizes each concept is being whatever other items in the same system are not. De Saussure uses a chessboard analogy where the value of each piece depends on its position on the board in relation to other pieces, in order to argue that signs only make sense as part of a larger, formal, generalized system. So the chess piece of a rook doesn't necessarily mean much in itself, but when you place it on a chessboard in relation to other pieces, then it suddenly gains so much more meaning as a potential threat to other pieces that are in its way, or as being threatened by other pieces that are in the position to take over the rook. Signs only gain meaning when they're put in that grid alongside other pieces. So that for De Saussure at least, meaning is purely structural and relational. The meaning of a sign lies in its systematic relation to other signs rather than deriving any meaning from inherent features of its own. So signs don't refer to an inherent essence they possess, they refer to each other in order to derive meaning. And no sign makes sense on its own, but only in relation to other signs. So you see a plane in the sky, and your brain automatically does this like classification process where it runs through all the possible things you could perceive in the sky and then rule them out by process of elimination by saying, okay, that thing in the sky is metal and it's not flapping wings, so it's not a bird. And that object flying isn't a saucer with crazy lights going on, so it's not a UFO either. And that object isn't a guy with a cape, so it's not Superman either. So you've eliminated all the possible other options it could be, and you're left with it's a plane. Of course, this happens instantaneously in your mind, so that it just seems so seamless and natural to perceive that thing in the sky and immediately recognize and interpret it as a plane. So let me use my artistic abilities to demonstrate the relationality of signs. Let me draw a signifier, if you will, and ask yourselves, what do you see? What do you interpret this signifier to be? I mean, the mind runs wild with possibilities. It could be a circle, could be the number 0, it could be the letter O, it could be a ring, it could be an O, I already said that, it could be a hole, it could be a dinner plate, it could be an infinite number of possibilities. And what happens if I were to draw another sign in relation to this sign? Okay, so now that I've put the first sign in relation to another one, it automatically narrows down and reduces the number of possibilities that this could represent. Now that we have these two in conjunction with each other, it could be it's no longer a hole or a ring, but it could still be the letters I, O, or L, O, or it could be numbers. It could be the number 10. And then what happens if I add another piece to the chessboard in a relational position to the first two? And again, it reduces the possibilities even further. I see 101. I see LOL. I see a dinner plate again with maybe like 2 chopsticks or cutlery. Maybe it's because I'm hungry that I'm automatically conjuring up culinary related signifieds. But what happens if I were to add another symbol here to further define the initial objects? Oh, now all of a sudden it's not 101. It's certainly not LOL anymore. It looks like a person with a rather large head and two skinny arms sticking up, and they're drowning in water, it looks like. So just by adding another piece to the chessboard, it automatically, dramatically changes the meaning, the signified behind the signifier. And you can add more pieces to change it again. So add a cute little eyes here and a nice big smiley face. And now you know that they're not actually drowning. They're just enjoying their time in the water. And we can add some nice flowing hair here. And yeah, now it's just a nice day at the beach in the water. So this is how our brains work. We want order, we want structure. Like when you were just subjected to the circle on its own, it induces a little bit of anxiety because you don't know what it is, what it's supposed to represent. It could be an infinite number of possibilities, but with each addition to the chessboard, it becomes more and more well-defined and reduces the number of possible meanings it could represent. For anyone interested, I will be turning this artwork into an NFT and putting it up for auction. We'll start the bidding in like 1 ETH. Actually, let me check the price of what 1 Ethereum is. So it's like 3,000. Oh, now it's 2,000. Oh, now it's 5,000. Oh, now 1 ETH is 0. Oh, now it's 7,000. Okay, so please bid as soon as possible because the value of ETH tends to be changing dramatically and quickly. So do you agree with de Saussure that the relationship between signifier and signified is always completely arbitrary? Like what about onomatopoeias? Words whose pronunciation mimic the sound that they're supposed to represent. For example, the words used to describe the sounds animals make, like quack. Wouldn't you say there's a bit of a natural connection between the sound of the word quack and the sound a duck makes that word is supposed to represent? Is that completely arbitrary, or is there some universal logic and natural connection between that word and the sound it signifies? But on the other hand, even this is culturally dependent to a certain degree. For example, the words used to refer to the sounds made by a rooster is, cock-a-doodle-doo in English, but in Italian, it's chi cri ki ki. And the sound of a dog barking in English is bow wow, but it's wah wah in French. So even onomatopoeias are still approximations based on the linguistic conventions of specific cultural contexts in which they're received and circulated.